I need you to stop what you're doing and listen to me very carefully. Something happened in the waters off Venezuela 3 weeks ago that the mainstream media buried in a single paragraph on page 7. A U.S. Navy destroyer intercepted a tanker carrying Venezuelan crude. They called it sanctions enforcement. What they didn't tell you is that this single action just triggered the largest wealth transfer in modern history. I'm not talking about oil prices. I'm not talking about geopolitics. I'm talking about the moment the global financial system realized that the rules of the game just changed forever. What happened off the Venezuelan coast wasn't random. It was the culmination of a strategy that's been years in the making. The signs were there if you knew where to look. The tanker was the Esperanza, 47,000 tons of Venezuelan heavy crude bound for Shanghai. The U.S. Navy destroyer USS Carney intercepted her in international waters, 93 nautical miles northeast of Puerto La Cruz. They boarded her under sanctions that most of the world doesn't recognize anymore. They seized the cargo, they arrested the crew. They towed the ship to a U.S. port, but there was nothing standard about what they'd actually just done. The payment was gold, real gold, 473 kilograms sitting in a Shanghai vault, already transferred, already owned by Beijing. The Americans seized the oil, but they couldn't touch the payment. The transaction was complete regardless of what happened to the cargo. For the first time in decades, a major energy transaction was completed entirely outside the dollar system. And when that news reached the trading floors in London and New York, something broke. I watched it happen in real time from my desk. I had screens showing dollar index futures, treasury yields, currency cross rates, gold spot prices. At 1547 EST, they all started moving in ways that didn't make sense. The dollar index didn't crash. It didn't collapse. It just paused. For 17 minutes, the most liquid market in the world stopped making sense. Bid-ask spreads that are normally microscopic suddenly gaped wide. Market makers pulled their quotes. Algorithmic trading systems started throwing error messages. Currency traders were calling their desks, asking if the screens were broken. Risk managers were frantically checking Reuters and Bloomberg for news that would explain the price action. They found nothing. The official story was just another sanctions enforcement. Routine, nothing special. But the market knew better. The market always knows first. Trading volumes in Shanghai gold futures exploded 600% in the hour after the news broke. Not speculative volume, commercial volume. Real buyers placing real orders for immediate delivery. Someone was converting massive amounts of yuan into physical gold, and they were doing it urgently. Currency swap rates between yuan and rubles spiked. Turkish, lira, Iranian, rial exchange volumes hit daily records. Cryptocurrency flows through decentralized exchanges suddenly surged in patterns that suggested institutional involvement. The smart money wasn't panicking. The smart money was repositioning fast. Let me explain what you're really looking at here. For 50 years, the United States has controlled global wealth through what we call the petrodollar system. Every barrel of oil sold anywhere in the world had to be bought with dollars. Every payment had to flow through New York banks. Every transaction had to be approved by the same system that prints the money. It was the perfect trap. If you wanted energy, you needed dollars. If you needed dollars, you had to play by American rules. If you broke the rules, they could cut you off from the entire system with the push of a button. Venezuela broke the rules, not by selling oil, by selling it for something the Americans couldn't print, couldn't seize, couldn't control. Gold doesn't care about sanctions. Gold doesn't recognize jurisdiction. When you pay in gold, the transaction is final the moment the bars change hands. The Chinese knew this. They've been preparing for this moment since 2008. While the West was playing financial engineering games, China was accumulating gold, not paper gold, not gold certificates, real bars, 4,400 tons of it sitting in vaults that aren't connected to the Western banking system, and now they're using it. The Esperanza wasn't an isolated incident. It was a test. China wanted to know if they could complete a major energy purchase without touching the dollar system. They wanted to know if the United States would risk a military confrontation to protect the monopoly. They got their answer. The Americans seized the oil, but they let the payment stand. They couldn't challenge it because challenging it would mean admitting that the dollar's monopoly is breakable. It would mean acknowledging that there's an alternative system operating in parallel. But the market saw it anyway. Within hours of the seizure, something unprecedented started happening in the physical gold markets. Not the paper markets where banks trade promises. The real markets where governments and central banks move actual metal. Shanghai started bidding aggressively for immediate delivery. Not futures, not contracts. Physical bars for pickup within 72 hours. They were willing to pay premiums that don't make sense unless you understand what they were really buying. They weren't buying gold as an investment. They were buying infrastructure. They were building the foundation for a parallel monetary system that operates independently of Western control. And they weren't alone. Reports started surfacing of similar transactions. Russia paying for Indian wheat in rubles and gold. Iran selling oil to Turkey for Turkish lira and precious metals. Brazil negotiating soybean exports to China with bilateral currency swaps that bypass SWIFT entirely. Each transaction was small, each one was defensible, but together they represented something that central bankers had nightmares about: the systematic abandonment of the dollar as the world's reserve currency. The Fed saw it coming. 3 days after the Esperanza incident, they quietly opened temporary liquidity facilities with friendly central banks, $14 billion in emergency currency swaps with major central banks. They didn't announce it. The press release was buried on page 47 of the Federal Reserve's website. But $14 billion isn't routine, it's panic money. Foreign central banks were quietly reducing their dollar positions. When bonds matured, instead of buying replacements, they converted to gold. Each transaction was small enough to avoid attention, but the aggregate flow was massive. The Bank of Russia increased gold reserves by 11% in 6 weeks. Turkey shifted $12 billion out of treasury bills. Even the Bundesbank requested physical delivery of New York gold for the first time since 2013. It's not dramatic, it's not violent, it's just systematic, like watching a dam leak. The first drops don't matter. But when the seepage reaches a certain point, the whole structure fails catastrophically. That point is closer than anyone wants to admit. Look at what's happening in the energy markets right now. Venezuela isn't the only producer selling outside the dollar. Iran has been doing it for years. Russia started after the Ukraine sanctions. Now we're hearing rumors about Saudi Arabia considering yuan payments for Chinese crude purchases. Each defection weakens the system. Each alternative payment mechanism creates a precedent. Each successful transaction outside the dollar proves that the monopoly isn't natural law, it's just policy. And policy can change. The wealth transfer isn't happening in stock markets or bond markets. It's happening in the infrastructure of money itself. Countries that built their reserves in dollars are watching those dollars lose their utility. Countries that prepared alternative systems are watching their strategic positioning improve overnight. China didn't just buy Venezuelan oil with gold. They bought proof that the system could work. They bought a template for every other energy transaction they'll make for the next decade. They bought leverage over every country that's still trapped in the dollar system. And the cost wasn't measured in billions. It was measured in the monopoly power that the United States just lost forever. This is why the mainstream media isn't covering it properly. This is why the story got buried. Because once people understand what actually happened, once they realize that the foundation of American financial dominance just cracked in international waters, the psychological impact becomes unstoppable. The dollar is still the world's reserve currency today. It's still used for most international transactions. But for the first time since Bretton Woods, there's a working alternative. Not a theoretical alternative, a proven one. And that alternative is being built transaction by transaction, barrel by barrel, bar by bar. The Esperanza was just the beginning. What comes next will determine whether the American century ends with a bang or with the quiet sound of wealth flowing east, beyond the reach of Western control, into a system that operates by different rules entirely. And those rules are already being written in boardrooms in Beijing and Moscow, in central bank meetings in New Delhi and Brasilia, in private negotiations between energy ministers and finance officials who understand that the next decade will look nothing like the last 5. The infrastructure is being built transaction by transaction. Alternative payment systems tested and refined with each successful trade. Security protocols developed, diplomatic agreements negotiated, military partnerships strengthened. China isn't just buying oil with gold. They're buying time. Time to complete the alternative system before the old one realizes how much power it's already lost. Venezuela isn't just selling oil for alternative currencies. They're proving that sanctions only work if there's no choice. Once there's a choice, sanctions become ineffective. And ineffective sanctions become geopolitical liabilities. The raid on Venezuela didn't just seize oil, it revealed the future. It exposed the cracks in a system that appeared invulnerable just months ago. It demonstrated that American financial dominance isn't natural law, it's policy. And policy can change. They can't unsink that tanker. They can't undo that transaction. They can't stop what they just proved is possible. They can't prevent other countries from drawing the obvious conclusions about what happens when you keep all your reserves in a system that can freeze them overnight. The wealth transfer isn't coming. It's happening. Right now. While you're reading this, in gold vaults and central bank reserves and shipping manifests that tell a story the headlines aren't covering. The game changed in international waters 3 weeks ago. Most people haven't realized it yet, but the ones who have are already positioning for what comes next. And what comes next is the end of the world as we've known it since 1971. The end of the petrodollar. The end of monetary monopoly. The beginning of something that looks very different. The Esperanza was carrying more than oil. It was carrying the future. And that future is no longer flowing west.